from when you guys start
Sure.
talking. Yeah, so our two speakers today are Keith Shu, who is DEI certified from the University of South Florida. He also has a master's degree in culture and gender strategy experience in the UN. And then we also have Kata Kaplar, who's also DEI certified from the University of South Florida, has a master's degree in organizational psychology, is mental health first aid certified in England, and also is certified as a career and transition coach by the European Mentoring and Coaching Council, and is an HR professional with UN experience as well. And so today we've asked them to come talk to us about microaggressions, specifically as they impact the AAPI community and what we can do about it. So please, yes, welcome. And yeah, maybe you guys can tell us more about Wingardium, sort of like the origins and sort of your mission.
Sure, sounds good. Hi, everyone. My name is Chong Hui. I go by Keith, and just easy for everybody. And so, yes, well, if we're explaining the name of the Wingardium, we'll have to go into Harry Potter, right? So, any Harry Potter heads here, show your hands. So, I came up with this name when I was watching the rerun, when Hermione so infamously said that line, it's Leviosa, not Leviosa. The levitation spell, it just made sense to me, because the purpose of Wingardium is to bring DEI learning to the world, to help elevate the society, people, and of course ourselves. So levitation spell just made sense. So I took the word. I love the word. So there it is. So we want to bring a lot of DEI resources to everyone who wants to learn. But also at the same time, we want to help people directly, help companies directly. So we also do consulting for companies in need. And that's what we're doing right now. So today we're here to talk to you about microaggression, well-being, resilience. And here's the agenda today. So we'll go through some definitions. We'll go through. Kata has a lot of research background, so she'll go into detail with a couple of items. But a few disclaimer before we start. We're not here to directly provide you with solutions, right? Because we don't know your life. We don't know what has happened or what you have experienced. All we can do is here to provide you with some information that can potentially support you, uncover potential solutions, and help you gain some more information so you can, go into situations knowing how to react or potentially how to process information, but never direct solutions. And also this webinar heavily relies on your participation and conversation. Otherwise, it will just be heavy on definition and information, then that wouldn't actually be very helpful. So at any point, if you have questions, if you feel comfortable enough, please speak up. We would love to hear from you. But if you are not comfortable speaking in front of other people, please send Yui or Kaori a direct message, and they will speak for you anonymously. All right. So what is microaggression to you? How would you describe microaggression? We're diving in with the first interactive conversation. Let's just get it started and talk about your own experience or talk about your understandings. Any takers?
I guess I would define a microaggression as something that, even if it has a positive connotation or a positive delivery or intention from the person saying it, basically just something that involves race in an unnecessary way that can be taken or received and perceived negatively. Like, even if somebody said something they intended to be positive, like, it doesn't have to involve your race. And I guess just things that are like small asides that don't feel overtly racist either, where it's like you almost question yourself and you're like gaslighting yourself, like, was that bad? Am I wrong? Is this not okay? That was a long-winded way to say that.
No, I think that's absolutely that's actually a really great way to say it, right? It's very we were having discussion preparing even for this webinar. Kata and I had our disagreements. What do you even define as microaggression? What do you when do you put the line of just, oh, that's just plain aggression now, or at some point sometimes it's just a misunderstanding. But that's why we're here to talk more and get into the nitty gritty. Anyone else?
I think it's also important to add that a microaggression can be either intentional or unintentional, because it might, like going off of what you said about a miscommunication between like sender and receiver, like regardless, it's a huge issue, but it isn't always intentionally intending to be an aggressive comment.
Absolutely. And we would recommend that through this webinar, maybe have some specific incidents or situations that you've experienced or you have witnessed in mind, to apply some of the theories or ask some questions so we can discuss with the actual examples. Then that'll be easier for us to all communicate and understand each other better. And Kata, take it away.
It would be helpful if I unmuted myself. I realized I need to add a personal disclaimer. I have seen a mirror today. I understand that I'm not in a position to speak about personal experience when it comes to racial microaggression in an Asian American context. So I will not pretend I understand that. What I'm talking to you about is more the theory and what microaggressions look like and why and how and what we can, because they're not all necessarily in a racial context, but the process and the results are very much the same. So as usual, if you were here last time and when we did this, then you know that I'm big on definitions and I pulled out a few. And very much what you've already mentioned is the main themes in what a microaggression is. Say, pick the first one: brief and commonplace verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities. It's a very pretty word. And all of the others, what they read is, it's very everyday, very commonplace, almost like familiar things. And, they're not big bang actions or words. And like you said, they're very often not intentional. And what is common in them is that they communicate a prejudiced attitude. I've practiced this word, I promise. Prejudiced attitude towards a member of a minority or a marginalized group. And so very often they're not intentional, and that makes it more difficult to address them. But it doesn't mean that they're not harmful. And that's one of the first difficulties in this whole microaggression conversation, is that the person who said the word or did the thing didn't mean anything harmful, but then the impact was harmful. And so the person who's going to speak up against it, hi, this wasn't cool, I found it offensive, what, you will feel like you're the confrontational person, the troublemaker. And then so the whole balance is even more towards something that you want to avoid. Can we move? Yeah. So we've talked about it already, why, and it all goes back to bias. And then when we think about the non-intentional part, a lot of the time it's just, we didn't think, and when I say we, I mean the person who committed the microaggression didn't think about it, doesn't know enough. We fill in a lot of gaps in our knowledge with assumptions from things that we've learned, beliefs that we just carry and we never question them. And so these assumptions could go two ways. One, this is a person of another group, and I have all of these beliefs or assumptions about this group on how they are different from me. Or on the other hand, and this happens to me a lot, is just I don't think, or I don't consciously think that not everybody has the same experience, the same background, the same thoughts. So it could also be that you just assume that everybody thinks the same way, has the same means, has the same experience, and that's how you make a comment or do something that then is perceived as harmful. And bias, especially when it's implicit, it builds a lot on the stereotypes that we use when we don't have enough knowledge, and also all of this fear and discomfort of what is different. And then we'll see later in the conversation, these are basically the things that we need to keep in check for ourselves, so we don't become one who is a microaggressor. And this helps to understand why they happen, and to some extent they might help choosing a method on how to address them.
I'll mute myself again. So okay, here's the next step, right? So how do they manifest? Where do they come from? Which aspects of our life that causes all this? Sorry, I'm going to lead all the interactive slides, and when I ask questions, it's directly addressed to you, and I will just sit here and wait quietly for a few seconds for someone to take position.
Keith, can you repeat that question again?
So how do they manifest? As the word just says, where do they come from? What caused the microaggression?
But also just like, what do they look like?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I would think that from like a where they come from, why do they happen standpoint, I feel like maybe it's like from a place of assumption and thinking that they know something, and then not actually taking the time to authentically understand that culture, but also that person. Because I think it's also important not to just lump one individual in with their culture, because they might have unique experiences. Like, I'm Japanese American, that's different than being Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that it's just kind of assuming things about people. Like today, for example, I just went and got my knives sharpened, and the guy who was sharpening the knives, nice enough guy, he remembered my name, which was really nice, and he even spelled it correctly, which is unusual for a white person who doesn't have very much exposure to Japanese culture. But it just so happens that he anecdotally has exposure to Japanese culture and is going to get to go to Japan for the first time next year. And I was like, okay, but every time that kind of conversation starts, I just start getting nervous of like, okay, what kind of assumptions are you going to make about me right now? Are you going to ask me if I like anime? Because I don't. Like that kind of thing.
No, absolutely. I was actually, I had recently had experience on the other side, right? So I was running a work event, and one of the participants is this extremely pale-skinned white girl with a Scottish last name. And, blonde hair, blue eyes. And then when we started talking, she told me she grew up in Singapore, and she speaks perfectly fluent Mandarin and has lived in Asia longer than I have at this point. Right? So I was in awe, but it was a safe place because I didn't actually make assumptions. I just talked to her as a participant, but I would assume that if I were to make any assumption or to ask questions with leading questions without understanding her background, it would all be wrong, completely wrong, right? So I think these are really great places to start catching ourselves, not even other people, to learn about the environment or how to create a better environment for others.
Okay, my turn. Sorry, I'm up with the slides. So like a bit of structuring them. So a microaggression can be many things. It could be a non-verbal action. The classic example in there is when a Black man gets into the elevator, the white woman who's already there kind of backs into the corner, clutches her purse. Nothing was said, but a lot was communicated. And then it can be words, of course, and those are probably the most frequent or the most well-known. And all of these, oh, your English is so good, you're so articulate, or where you're really from. All of these things are conveyed in like a verbal message. And like, I don't remember which one of you was, but maybe one of you said that very often those look like or try to look like a compliment. You know, it's a positive on the surface, a positive thing, and then the message with them still is that, oh, compared to what I expect you based on your race or gender or your looks to be, you're actually so much better. That's not a compliment. It still carries all that judgment from the minority, like the assumption of the minority group. And then when we say environmental, that's very hard to point out, and that's even more difficult to address. And what I mean is, like, if you walk into a space, a workplace, a school, a club, and there's nobody who looks like you, but there's nobody who doesn't look like all the others. Like, basically the minority group is the only type of person present. And again, doesn't have to be only in a racial context. And then also the physical environment, you know, the easiest thing to see is this building accessible? If it's not, then the underlying message is we don't really care if you need to get in here with a wheelchair or some other mobility support. And I put invalidation separately, which is most of the time a verbal action, but I think it's important to treat it separately, because what happens there is that probably a first instance of microaggression already happened, and then there's the person who decided to take the energy and the stance to point out that this was actually not cool. And then what happens is that they just get brushed off, like, oh, come on, it's not a big deal, you know, nobody got hurt, why are you so sensitive? Happens all the time. So basically what happens there is that the experience that the person had is just treated as not valid or not important enough. And this can come from a peer, or this can come from somebody, and that's even more serious when it comes from somebody in a position of power. You know, if somebody who's hierarchically above you does something that's a microaggression or something offensive to you, and then you say, actually, I don't think that's an appropriate generalization to make, and they say, oh, come on, don't be that sensitive. That's even worse, because then the message is that, no, on an organizational level, we don't really care about your sensitive feelings. Mieko, am I pronouncing it right? You have a question?
Yes, sorry, I didn't realize I was muted and I started responding. Yes, you did pronounce it correctly. Thank you. I was curious, per your point about accessibility, at what point, or like, is there a threshold where you can start saying, you know, as a language barrier, this is a microaggression, where like we're not accommodating and we're not creating an accessible space from a language standpoint? But I feel like that maybe is a harder distinction, because there might be like a nationally recognized language, but then you start getting into like what populations and demographics of people speak different languages. Like what is your opinion or your experience with what that kind of threshold would be?
That's a very good point. And I do have experience with that. Actually, I think mentioning that something is not, it doesn't feel inclusive to you, I think your threshold is valid. And then what they can and will do about it, that's a different story. But very often these things don't get taken anywhere because we don't feel like we have the right to mention it. I worked in an environment where it was on paper an international organization, 12 nations and a couple of other from the fringes, but there was a workforce, because we were in Hungary, a lot of Hungarians in some units. In IT, there were a lot of them, in finance, and very often what would happen is that they would just talk among themselves. And okay, that's the host nation language and we're located in their military base, whatever, but it's not the language of the organization. And of course, not everybody speaks it. And I think, and I do speak Hungarian, that's just outright rude. So it's, you know, something that everybody could very easily mitigate, because you have to speak English to be employed there. So obviously everybody has a working level of English. They're just not making the effort. So I think I would go with like what is realistically expectable from the organization, and that's something that you can insist on and on it. But a lot of my views, I admit, are very, well, either idealistic or very radical for what we are in general. But to me, when you feel that something is, one, outright rude, and two, could be done differently without major changes. You know, you don't have to make everybody learn a new language. We already have a common language. Now, when it comes to everybody speaking the same language, but to different levels because of their seniority, their roles, their education, I'm not sure I have one good answer, but even then I would think that trying to include everybody is what we should be aiming for. And you would know, when in an organization, you would know where are your gaps. And I don't know, everybody speaks some level of English, everybody speaks some level of Spanish. It's going to be a mix anyway. And, it goes back a lot to psychological safety. Do you have an environment that you feel allows you to raise this? And if you don't, then that's the first problem for the organization. And what I wanted to say about this from the beginning, none of this is fair, because it's always on the recipient to decide what to do with the microaggression. And even if you decide to just walk away, it's already have been some kind of mental and emotional energy that you had to spend on it. And the whole thing wasn't initiated by you. You didn't want it. It shouldn't have happened. But even just mitigating it is going to be energy from you. I don't know if that answers the question or just raises more.
So I'll jump in here too. Sorry, Inga, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, that definitely helps address the question. And I had a mild follow-up that maybe I'll just say for the end, because I don't want to take away from too much time. So, Chi, what were you going to say?
Oh, no, go ahead. We can just ask a follow-up question. We can answer them together.
Oh, okay, all right. My follow-up was just going to be, it feels like so many of the ways that we try and attempt to fix these kind of situations or like educate for the future is always so retroactive or kind of reactive. And like, for example, at my vet school, we don't have closed captionings on many of the video recordings that we have to reference as learning material. And I have no hearing problems, but I really like closed captions. And we don't have a hard of hearing or deaf student, but I know of a veterinary student who's sharing her journey on social media, and she is deaf, and she's having to pioneer so much in her program. And I'm just wondering, like, it feels like so much of the change that we try and ask for is in reaction to, oh, this person is not receiving the same level of opportunity as others. Now we need to change it. And it feels like a lot of people react negatively when there isn't a person desiring or requiring that accommodation or need. And I don't really know what to do about that.
I think that's actually a perfect follow-up question. I was just about to mention the caption part, because for me, I came to the US when I was 16, so I've already missed the prime English learning age, and I had a lot of trouble because I learned English by struggling through by listening to others. So for the longest time, I would slur words and try to get the sentence by, because when you say sounds somewhat similar, people kind of understand you. But then I figure out, oh, there's captions. It's an option. And till this day, even though I have no problem listening and speaking, I still watch all the English TV shows with captions. It's a nice tool to assist, regardless if we have our listening problem, hearing problems, or visual problems. I think that's a big step, even if we're reactive right now towards problems, because we are starting to notice issues we didn't know existed before, because we didn't allow these people to speak up. We didn't give them a voice. So I think, to answer your question, reactive problem solving is an important first step towards setting up a system that allows everyone to access without them having to say, I need this tool because it's already built in. So I think every time we see a problem, adopt it and kind of improve the system a little bit. That's how we get to a better system. And to adding the microaggression part, it would be, I think the line is when, I guess, normal people, right? Like that feels like a bad word to say now, but people who don't need extra help, people who don't need extra tools to live their daily life because they have the privilege. The microaggression is when they say, oh, this annoys me, we shouldn't have it, right? This annoys me, this bothers me, or it just, why are there random words on my screen when I can understand everything? I think these kinds of reactions are microaggression, or even just plain aggression, because they are saying, because I don't need it, my perfectly normal life, because everything was built for me, shouldn't be disturbed. I think that, for me, is the line of where the microaggression starts.
And also a lot of what you mentioned is the case for diversity across the board, because, what we always argue is that you wouldn't have this issue if you had the one person with a disability in the group of people who make decisions. If you have the one single mother, then there is somebody who constantly has to think about childcare and traveling and school holidays. If you have the one person who needs captions or some other type of accommodation, they will always think about that because they need it for themselves. And so that's always the case that's why your decision-making team needs to be diverse. So everybody brings in, and it's not just a nice word, like they bring their own experience. Yes, they do. And they also bring in the problems they experience that your hopefully diverse workforce is going to experience. And, this is how you can anticipate them. But very often, and it's not the case for closed captions, but very often the counter argument is resources. Like, oh, we don't have the money and right now we don't need it.
Oh, and also another point I have for Miko's first question, where does it start? Because in this kind of situations, there is a clear line, right? Because something needed to be built in. But as Asians, I'm not sure if it's a universal experience, but feels quite general, is that we grew up with a lot of microaggression from our parents. A lot of them is built into our lives in every single corner. So I think we've already crossed the line a long time ago with where it started, right? So I think now it's just a time of us recognizing in our own behavior which part was microaggression or which part is a result of microaggression, right? Because I was talking to someone 2 days ago. I was actually on a vacation in Mexico, and I was having this conversation with the half Asian, half German woman, and we were talking about these, and we realized a lot of it is just, we watch our parents' behavior and we analyze them and we react accordingly, just so we can avoid a yelling or beating. That is a result of not even microaggression, some form of microaggression, some form of aggression, but for us, there is a voice constantly in the background, kind of a self-induced microaggression, like, oh, don't do this if you don't want to have a bad consequences. And if you translate that into a real world, there's a lot of self-implied and hidden microaggression everywhere. I think trying to find a line will be very difficult. I think we should just start with, understanding it and how to react to it, or how to equip yourself with more tools of how to deal with them first.
And the line
Thank you. That was really great.
Sorry. The line is your line. Anytime there's and it's, it's a suspicion that I'm being told something or done something that has probably more to do with my membership in any minority group than the actual situation work conversation at hand. And usually if you start questioning it, there probably is something in there. What I just wanted to say on this, and then we can move on, is that the term originally was used only for racial microaggressions, but now it's been expanded to basically any kind of marginalized group. And that also means that the intersectional concept also applies to it. You know, you can be in a minority group based on your race, you can be another one based on your gender, you can be in a privileged group for one and in a minority one in the other. And sometimes these have compound effects, and then some people who are at those intersections are actually exposed to even more microaggression than some of the others. And what's important here also is that we probably all have some privileged identities and some minority identities, which then means that we can be both. You know, we probably have been on the receiving end of microaggressions, and we probably have all been the microaggressor, or like the person who committed it. Maybe we didn't know. I have a few examples that I've realized much after the fact that actually this was something that I would now not do because I know that it was not appropriate. But just to say that it doesn't make us exempt from being aggressive or microaggressive just because we're also on the receiving end. Okay.
Kaori, do you want to explain your comment?
Oh, well, I'm sure y'all seen that hilarious YouTube video with the Asian woman who's running, and she runs into the white guy who keeps asking her, "Where are you from?" No, really, where are you from? You know, and then she turns it around on him and does it to him, and it obviously sounds ridiculous. And so that's kind of what my gauge is. Like if it sounds really stupid, if you said it to a white person, it's probably a microaggression.
That's wow, yeah, that's a nifty little tool.
They say that a lot too. So I have also been very vocal about catcalls and all that comes with that. And I think there's a similar saying there, like, if you wouldn't say this to a man in jail, probably just don't. And that's also that's a good rule of thumb. Like, would you do it? Because, you know, we would probably be afraid of the reaction, but that just means that you're actually aware of the impact of what you're doing. You just think, I'm not going to go and beat you up.
All right, let's move on because we still have quite a bit to cover.
What's the impact of this? Every time this happens, there's a stress response from the body because, you know, it's perceived as a threat. And even if you choose to not react to it, the trigger has been there. So over time, especially if it happens frequently and repeatedly, this can result in chronic stress, which has impacts on your body. And of course, it has relation to mental health issues. And again, for people in the intersections who are more exposed to all of this, it probably happens faster, or is it more severe? And also access to mental health support, and even just the habit and the culture of seeking out help is probably lower the more minority identities one has. And for what it means for the Asian American population is that's beautiful model minority myth, which is really not helpful in this context either, because what it means, what we've said at the beginning, that, oh, very often these are disguised as positive comments on the surface. And this is applicable at large to the idea of the model minority. And also because racial consciousness, apparently, and this is things I've read, right? Like I've said, I have not experienced these. It appears later in Asian Americans than, say, in Black Americans, because the study years, the college years experience is exactly, aren't you supposed to be good at math? And if you're the hard worker and the good student, then the effort that you put into what you do is recognized more or less fairly, you know, a lot of work, good grades, graduate on top of your class, great, you know, you're a good student. And then what happens is that when people enter the workforce, the exact same amount of very hard work and probably same level of performance is not recognized at the same level, because it's the grades are actually fairly measurable compared to what it is in the workforce, and then the recognition is not there. And because the previous experience wasn't explicitly overtly negative, there's a lot of internalizing of the myth, and then, you know, maybe I'm the problem. And then also because race and racism in the US is still very often is considered and talked about on a binary, you know, it's a black versus white. And then so any other ethnicity's experience with racism is either dismissed or not taken that seriously. And again, a lot of this can be internalized, like, oh, actually, no, I don't have it as bad as somebody else. And that's never a good practice to compare your experience, like your suffering, to somebody else's, because somebody else having it worse does not invalidate your experience. And then on top of that comes with the experience of growing up in a culture, coming from a culture where keeping quiet, carrying on, putting in the hard work is valued, whereas speaking up for yourself or against something that happened is not necessarily historically a value or a habit. And also, again, the culture of seeking out mental health support or even just access to it is not necessarily there. So you can be stuck in this somewhat internalized stereotype of still being the model minority and kind of like trying to suppress the negative experience because, oh, it's maybe not a big deal, and anyway, we don't complain, we do what we have to do. And that can have even more severe mental health implications for Asian American population. Interesting, I read a few pieces. I'm going to send you a lot of articles if you want to nerd out the way I do. A lot of this experience can be very different along the gender lines. So Asian American men experience it differently than Asian American women, also depending on the race of the aggressor and, you know, whom they expect rejection from more than other. Very interesting, but like the bottom line is very simple. The mental health implications of racial microaggressions are very well present, and sometimes they're even present in the treatment. So like therapists and the way mental health is addressed in Asian American patients. The one more point I wanted to make is the organizational impact of all of this, not just racial, but microaggressions at large. And that goes back to the stress situation. So the stress response height makes people sick physically, mentally, and also because stress is a factor in organizational effectiveness and organizational performance. And because I always make this plea, I know that here we're more talking about the individual coping mechanisms, but I think anytime anybody is potentially in a decision-making or even just comment-making position, these need to be called out because these are not going to be solved individually. It has to be addressed organizationally and systemically. And so I just wanted to make the point that when you look for literature on organizational performance and behaviors, the term incivility is also used, not just the aggression. And there's a number of reasons for that. And one of them is that aggression carries this very strong connotation of intent, whereas incivility is a little bit more neutral in tone. And then so it triggers a lower level of resistance, which then makes it easier to even discuss. And also because a lot of the older literature links organizational performance and effectiveness to civility, incivility, and civil behavior. All right, done with the slide. Okay, two more topics that I'd like us to talk about is how do you respond, which is your reaction to the person who has, I don't know, it feels so criminal to say committed microaggression, but executed doesn't sound any better either. So the person in question, and then what do you do to yourself to complete the stress cycle? So all of those reactions from the stress trigger don't damage your body and your mind any more than necessary.
All right, so I think I messed up the slides a little bit. I think she was talking about this slide, response versus complete stress cycle. My bad. So now we come to this, right? So what to do? How do we respond to that? Has anyone here has example that how you've tried to deal with microaggression yourself? What did you do? Did you learn something from it? And did you come to a conclusion that you would do it differently the next time?
Hi. I think responding to microaggressions is the hardest for me, mostly because I don't really register that it happened until far later. And then oftentimes it's too late to respond in the moment. And so I guess over time, I've learned to pick up certain patterns that I've realized are microaggressions, and I can respond to those a little bit quicker. But I think the harder ones that I still haven't developed like a really good mechanism for coping are just the ones that like really pop up a lot later. And they just kind of brew for a while, and then I keep brewing over all the possible scenarios until I inevitably experience another microaggression, and then I'm a little more prepared to respond in the moment. But yeah, I don't know. I'm open to hearing tips that you want.
I know it happens a lot, but it's always still so weird to hear these words said to me, because I remember everything. I remember things from 10 years ago. I'm still thinking potentially was there a better outcome. I think that is a result of years of microaggression, right? Like you also the result of us being taught to keep our heads down. If things are not that bad, let it go. But that's the thing, we physically keep all of the pain inside. Your brain, well, we have the capacity to remember everything, and it gets just harder and harder unless we process them. Right. And I think what you said is that, you're starting to recognize the patterns and learn how to deal with some simpler ones. That's a great start. I think we just need to take a step further, start to actually recognize patterns or what impacts us the most, right? Because like Kata said just now, everyone has their own privilege. We all experience microaggression or any sort of a message differently. So before we can help others or help others to stop this kind of microaggression then or micro incivility, we need to first recognize how to identify the patterns and to be able to process that information at moment's notice instead of sitting at home eating a tub of ice cream and pondering, I could have said this, this, and this. Oh my God, why am I so only witty 10 hours later, right? Because I think that's because these kind of microaggressions don't kick off our fight or flight instinct. It's just a message that passes through. When we leave the moment and we have the time by ourselves thinking about the day we just went through, then they all hit us. It's not that to say it's a bad thing, I think, because that means we don't react too aggressively or too irrationally without thinking through it. It's a little bit heavier on ourselves. It's a little bit harder for us. So I think it's a fine line. I think the key point here is that find the best method for yourself of how to deal with it, how to process the information. And if you want to intentionally want to practice and capture this moment, I think the best thing for you to do is identify all the patterns of what type of microaggression or what type of message that gets to you the most or in fact affects you the most.
Thank you. I actually had a follow-up if there's time. And it would other people have mentioned also like the gaslighting effect. Like I feel like I've been gaslit my whole life. And so when I'm brewing, like post microaggression brewing, I usually do it like in the shower right before I go to bed. And I like a part of that brewing is also like me gaslighting myself. It's like, am I wrong? Like, did I feel this wrong? Did I experience this wrong? Did I perceive this wrong? And then like, I feel like that's actually a lot harder to deal with too. And so I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Catalin. Yeah, you mentioned earlier like a psychological safety. And that's like an interesting, and maybe I'm misremembering this, but I've not heard that before. And so I feel like, I don't know, I'm interested in ways to enhance that for myself, I guess. If you have any like tools or tips.
The first part of your question, and I think that's again one of the hardest things like, to decide if I'm rightfully offended. And usually my answer is you probably are. And I was just thinking like, you walk around your house and you stub your toe somewhere and it hurts. And who's going to decide if it hurts? You're the only one who knows. So, if you're in the shower brewing about it, then it probably did trigger something in you. And I don't even know like overly sensitive, what does that mean? It's probably that you're more sensitive than the average, but then so what? I also read faster than the average, and that's just, those are individual differences. And if you felt that was offensive, then it was. And then that's a difficult part of the conversation because, but I didn't mean it. And yes, that's fine, but it still landed that way. And that's difficult to accept on both sides. Psychological safety, we could have a whole other webinar on it. It's more of an organizational concept. How do you create an environment where people actually where people can speak up when something is not right, and it doesn't have to go all the way to a formal complaint. Because very often when we talk about these things, people are like, it's going to be a harassment claim and it has to go to ethics and I don't know, or disciplinary. It doesn't have to get that far, but you need to have an environment where it's okay to say, well, actually, I think that was fairly sexist. And then, or maybe you just say this was inappropriate, and the person doesn't attack back, but says, all right, let me think about this. And this is very hard. Culture change is very hard, and all of these sound very fluffy, and ain't nobody got time for it. But that's what it means. You need to be able to create and maintain an environment where people can say, like, I didn't appreciate that tone. And if you nip it there, it's not necessarily going to become a big deal. But usually you just ignore it until it actually brews over, and then you have to go to the disciplinary. That's the HR person in me talking.
So recently, since we're on this slide and there's the team up and speak up for others, and I think that's one of the good solutions for me, especially if any of you has a person at work that shares your experience that you can talk to, because we see things differently, and especially when we were raised to be very hard on ourselves to be better. Self-criticism is a really difficult thing to get rid of. Right. So if you have someone who shares that, who you can talk to, it will be very, very helpful. And yes, so Carly just said that she's much better at standing up for others than myself, because yes, I think many people have that trait, because we've learned you want to help your friend out. You want to lend a hand whenever you can. But when it comes to yourself, like, I can do it. I don't want to bother others. Right. But we just need that for each other. And I recently saw this a lesson from a coach that was talking about how to manage your own emotions and anger. And I think it actually applies here, is that he takes it into different steps. The first step is you look at the situation. So you analyze the situation to see what exactly is going on here, right? And then second step is you recognize the emotions at play there. So if someone's being microaggressive to you, or it's becoming a pattern, maybe identify if this person's feeling anger towards you, if this person's, if there's jealousy, if there's some other emotions that we don't normally see, we just need a moment to actually recognize them. Then after that, you can identify the conflict, the conflicting value right there. Because a lot of times, potentially, that microaggression wasn't even directed to you intentionally, right? That's why a lot of them are unintentional. Maybe they've had a bad experience with this racial group, or maybe something at work, and someone at work is bothering them, and you're just happening to be there, and they took it out on you. So identify the conflicting value there. And then the last time, maybe we can have a very easy and relaxed and nobody's feelings getting hurt conversation. Like, what's going on there? Are you okay? Or, was there something between us that I didn't know? So I think these take the slow step to help yourself or the other person to kind of solve this myth of why this happened. And if you have a friend there, that'll be even better, because they can help you identify things for yourself as well. Okay.
So some of it, like this whole teaming up, could actually prevent some of this from happening. My example here is always, interestingly enough, if I walk on the streets with a man, nobody dares to catcall me. So, the whole thing didn't happen clearly because they respect the other person more than they respect me. And I think that's probably applicable in workplace situations too. Like, if and of course you can't always hang out with your buddy at work and do everything together, but very often it would just not happen. The same way we said you wouldn't say this to a white person, you probably wouldn't say it if a white person was just there. And that's, again, that's a lot of power somebody's presence just. And that there's also, we're just going to go all over the place with the points now. When you're a bystander, and you're apparently we all are better at speaking up for others, you can also just say, like, this doesn't sound cool, that doesn't look like enthusiastic consent. Like, what did you mean by that? Because you have that distance, you're probably better at seeing what's going on, because many of you mentioned, like, I don't think about it when it happens, because either you don't notice or you're just so shocked. Like, did you actually say that? Or did they actually do what, or the face they made? And then when there's a third person, they're not that emotionally involved, and it's easier to say that sounded a little off. What did you mean? And usually the excuse me, what do you mean? The asking for clarification. That's a good way. And the few in the first couple of points I listed are fairly low conflict. What I call low-key correct is really just that my name gets butchered a lot. In Hungary, my family name; outside Hungary, my first name. And I used to not care. That fine, I know what they mean, and now I do. But what I do is that I just interrupt and just say it correctly. So if they call me Katie, I just say Kata, and then we carry on. And so that's very simple, because the message that there was a mistake has been delivered, but I didn't make a big deal of it. And they also just registered, okay, that's how it is. And this works with some situations, not all of them, but because I also prefer to avoid conflicts, this works out for me. I just, this, not that. I don't even say actually it's pronounced like this. I just say it the right way. And then oh, sorry, what did you mean by that? What does that mean? I don't understand. And then we talked about the humor part. When they tell you that your English is so good, and then you just go back like, yours too, where did you learn it? Or like, oh, I should hope so. I've done all my schools in the US. And I've read somewhere that we should actually just go around and preemptively ask white Americans, where they from? No, but where are you really from? And yes, it does sound ridiculous. It has a bit of an edge, but it's still fairly peaceful. And then, it's always going to be an individual threshold to you, but also to the situation. What is it that you can put up with today? how grave or how severe is the insult, and like overall, is it worth it? And if you decide today and then again tomorrow and all the time this happens, to be a cycle breaker, which is a beautiful expression, sadly kind of rhymes with troublemaker. So that's something that we need to be aware of. And I find myself, as I get older and angrier, I do it more. But it does come with, you know, and also depends on your work environment. I find myself being a lot more outspoken when I work in like a project or a deployment environment where I know I'm going to be out in 9 months tops. And like, do I care if they remember me as the one who always said that? Somebody has to. But it's easier when your professional future doesn't depend on it. And yes.
Sorry, I just want to be mindful of everyone's time. We are at 1 hour mark, but if you're happy to stay a few minutes later, we just have a few more slides, and then we'll have a little more conversation Q&A.
Okay, yeah, maybe I just glance over it and we go to the stress cycle, which is more pleasant, unless anybody has a question about any of these points now.
Okay, stress cycle.
Because that's the important part of what we can do for ourselves when a microaggression situation happens. And why we have to do it is because, you know, we've talked about the stress trigger and the flight or flight. And so when we perceive a threat, which used to be a tiger and now it's just any kind of threat, our body gets ready to respond. And that's a very physical response, you know, the muscles, the heartbeat, the blood sugar, the blood pressure. You probably know this better than I do. But then we don't actually go and fight the tiger. So the body stays in this alert. And that's really not helpful because it needs to come down back to like normal operating mode to carry on with the day. And if we don't complete the cycle when the threat was psychological or it was just a perception of threat, then we stay in this alert mode for the rest of the day, the week. And so a couple of things that we can do are listed there. And I know we always say, oh, exercise is great for stress. Yes, it is. You can't always run to the gym, but when somebody's being rude to you, it doesn't have to be a full workout. What it can be like, I don't know if you like jumping jacks, but then jumping jacks, but also like just a one song dance off in the office between 2 meetings or 2 patients. I used to do that a lot in the first pandemic year because I was really not a happy camper. A couple of times a day, I would just put on music and dance around my living room. Both laughing and crying is good for you. Not just the emotional part, but you know, crying is good for you for many reasons. We just stopped doing that because somehow we labeled it as a weakness. And then bringing the body back down to the calm place with the deep breathing. It doesn't take long. It does take like a quiet room. And when I say physical affection, it's a good long hug, and it doesn't have to be romantic at all. And also, I understand it's not always easy to have a hugging buddy at work, but if you do good for you, it does marvels to the nervous system, or at least to mine. It's a quick and very effective way to calm down. And then talking to people, basically to re-engage in a pleasant conversation, like a pleasant interaction after an unpleasant one. And it could be anything. You can just talk to the barista a little bit longer than you do, or something that's very, very strange for me, but I know that in the US, people talk to you in the elevator. Absolutely. For Hungary, you don't look at other people in the elevator. But if you do, you know, that can also be just a pleasant chit chat if you go up like 15. And talk to people who understand your experience, so you know, friends, family, anybody who's closer to you, and they probably have similar experiences, or at least they understand how is it for you when you're upset and what you do with that. So any of these, I would go for the dance off and probably the hug, but any of these can work. And when I was preparing these 2 slides, I felt like we don't actually have a lot of great tools to fix the problem. We can just, like you said earlier, we can just reactively fix some of the results of it, but we're very far from actually just getting rid of microaggressions. I just wanted to recognize that.
I also, sorry, I just realized they have access to kill animals to hug. It's a very good
that's
perk.
true. Oh, okay. I should have put that in the list. Oh, therapy pets.
Those are good
yes.
perks. Yeah. Yeah,
Kari.
Kari. Yeah.
Well, I did want to comment though. I think that all of the suggestions you gave in the previous slide, right? Anything that we can do to make the microaggressor more aware that they did it, right? That's an educational moment, right? I'm like you said, I'm sure that I'm guilty of having committed microaggressions in the past. And, you know, I think most people want to do the right thing, and most people, you know, are innately good. And so, yeah, I would be horrified if that was brought to my attention, and I would change my behavior. So unless we speak up and unless we do something, it's never going to change. So I think all of these things, you know, that is the beginning of changing it.
And also,
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
when you come forward and say, I've done these things, and I have a couple of examples where actually I'm guilty of the where is he from, it also gives, and that goes back to psychological safety in a way that, you know, that shows the others that, like, you know, the roof is not going to come down. Yes, I've made a mistake. I recognize it was not a great behavior, and I try not to do it again. And so that gives space for others to think back on their actions. And okay, they're probably not going to go, oh yeah, I did that too, I did that too, I did that too. But that's also not the point. We want everybody to be a little bit more aware of what they do and why they do it.
So now we go into resilience.
Oh, we're really over time. I'm sorry. I really appreciate that.
It's okay. We've been having great discussions. It's fine.
Oh, resilience. So yeah, that's my personal disclosure. I am not a big fan of this word, or maybe it's more accurate to say I'm not a big fan of the hype around the word. And the reason why I copied out the APA definition is because I wanted to point out, so according to the APA, resilience is the process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging life experiences, especially through mental, emotional, behavior, flexibility, and adjustment to external and internal demands. What does it say? It says that resilience is a process, but it's also an outcome. You're not just born being resilient. And to me, that means that you had to go through difficult, challenging life experiences to learn how to adapt to them and how to adjust your behavior. And this is how you've become resilient. And that's the reason why I don't like when resilience is framed as this great personality trait. Yeah, there's a lot of learning that we can use and make it useful in the future. But I think there's a limit after which I don't need another challenging life experience to be more resilient. You know, that's what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think everybody comes to a point where I actually don't need to be any stronger. So please do not give me any more challenging experiences. The upside of all of this is that, yes, some of it you can learn. And when we were preparing for this, I gave the example of going to the dentist for like not the first time, you know, having your wisdom tooth removed. And if you had one before, or you didn't have all four taken out like Keith did in one time, then you kind of know what's coming, and you know it's not pleasant, but you know what kind of support you need. You know if you need drugs, you know if you need somebody to be there to hold your hand, somebody to drive you home. Like, what do you need to have at home to get through this experience, which is not going to be pleasant, but it's necessary. And a lot of resilience and the levels of it depends on individually on the mindset and the perception and the locus of control, and also what are your coping strategies. But it's true that the more you see, the more you know. I want to recognize that resilience comes from difficult experiences. So yes, it's great that we've learned from it, but sometimes I wish I didn't have to go through all of those experiences.
But I mean, I had a great time taking my wisdom teeth out. That story made me look very tough. I got all four of them out at the same time and took a taxi home by myself. So But no, that's beside the point. But so here, one more slide of how to deal with your own microaggression, right? Because we've had a lot of conversation today, and we recognize that we can be on both sides, and most of us will probably have been on both sides. So maybe don't beat ourselves up or self-criticize, be too hard on ourselves, because God knows we're doing enough of that. But what if in a situation you realize, what if I'm the bad one? What if you just say, oh, I didn't realize it soon enough, but this side you did something, you said something to other people. So, how do we learn to prevent them? I think talk to each other and identify your own behavior pattern and recognize the identity, identify the cause and the roots of the problem is much more important than going directly to solve that one instant, right? Because it's a patch. It doesn't actually fix it. So like we talked about before, if you have a friend with you, it'll be much easier if you can help each other create a safe space and help each other to identify these things, a pattern within yourself or each other, so we can do better. And if you guys have a time that you think you said or did something to others, feel free to share the example, and then we can dissect it if you want.
Well, I already mentioned mine in the chat. I've totally asked another Asian person where they're from.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. I mean, it's quite an interesting thing, because I had a lot of people ask me can you identify all the different kinds of Asians? I was like, oh my God, that's such a challenging thing. It's almost impossible just by looking at face and telling exactly what it is. But I tend to want to, right? And then in turn, it becomes some sort of error, and then makes the other person uncomfortable. So maybe, oh my God, I'm remembering this. Someone said to me, we have, because of all the DEI talk, we have so many rules in the society right now that what's fun anymore? You're blocking all the fun, and comedians don't even have the freedom to say everything. But that's coming from a perspective of I'm guessing very white background that has all the privilege, so they can make all the jokes and people laugh at it at the price of other people suffering, right? But a lot of jokes stays behind. And I was telling Kata before, I was like, I sometimes make the Asians have squinty eye jokes, because I was like, oh, like maybe it's okay for me to say it, but then at what cost? And I don't know if all the recipients are comfortable with that comment. I think one time I made a white guy very uncomfortable, and he thought, because he was one white guy in a group of Asians, and I said that, everybody laughed, and then he looked nervous, right? As if he did something wrong. But so, I think maybe if we just start recognizing all of our own patterns, find out the roots and what the cause is, that might be better than attacking that one specific instance.
And also, I think, and that's the example I gave on I asked about somebody where they from. And I had like a very logical sequence of why that question came to me, because of what they look like and what their name looked like. And also before that, I was in an environment where we were all foreigners. I was in the DRC, and of course, everybody was from somewhere else. And all of that doesn't matter, because, and luckily I asked this to a third person. Had I asked the person themselves, like, oh, but where you're from, it would have been just like the classic example of, you didn't think this through, because it doesn't matter why I was curious. The message it sends is still like, oh, my assumption is that you do not belong there. And that's the impact. And that's why it's separate from my intention, which was curiosity, but also like, why does it matter to me? Just wanted to know. And I think that's like, you can have that curiosity, and as it turned out, I should have just brushed up on my colonial history, and I could have figured out why the name doesn't match what I expect the person to present. A lot of it is either not that important, or you can find out otherwise, or yeah, I don't know if there's like the right way or situation to ask somebody where they're from, and especially the really from, like they just told you where they're from, and that's the whole invalidating their own experience. You know, a lot of the mansplaining is like that, when you say something that you know for a fact and somebody just tells you like, oh, well, actually it's not like that. It's, what do you do with that? And also, what's their intention with telling you that Central Time and Eastern Time are the same or not?
All right, so sorry for the long stretch of conversation. We're here at Q&A. If you have any more questions, please feel free to ask. And if you have questions later, of course, you can email us or email Yu and Kali, and we can relay the message.
And we are going to send you a post-webinar survey where we would like you to tell us how it did. And also it's going to include like a free text box in case you are willing to give us a testimonial that we can put on our site and promote our work to others. Yes.
Yes, Mieko.
I was wondering, when you get somebody who comes up to you or in conversation and says like, oh, where are you from? Or like, oh, what type of Asian are you? Like, what's a good response to help respond in a way that says like, hey, that's not the greatest way to ask that? Or because I know that some people are really genuinely wanting to learn about a culture. And if you have the space for that, you can decide to be an ambassador for your culture that day. But I don't really know a great kind of scripted response beyond just kind of internalizing that and then just answering.
Okay, so I don't actually remember where I learned this, but so the idea of elevator pitch, right? I think every young professional has heard of it. Is someone that would advise you come up with an elevator pitch so you can do things in 30 seconds, promote yourself. I think there's the same thing to this. Because we've all experienced this. So slowly you've gone through different kinds of answers, right? Different kind of reactions. So for me, when people say like, oh, of course it's easier for me because I was born and raised in China, quick answer. But when people ask me like, oh, like, about my life in the US or whatever, it gets complicated. And if they ask questions offensively, or they say the things like, oh, your English is really good for Chinese, like, what happened there? How did you learn it? My response is I start off by saying how much time you have, right? And then you can curate a quick story or one punchline to kind of steer away from the tension. But once you get into a story, you can maybe tell them, potentially not ask someone who you don't know their ethnic background or who you're not very familiar with that kind of question, or rephrase it, or help them find a better way that they can ask. I think that might be a approach that you can take.
And for me, I think it's also it's an interesting reaction, or like a question back, like how specific is the question? What in particular of my culture are you interested in? Do you want to know what we cook for whatever holiday? Because that's also going to be like, this is what we do in my family, and just how cultural it is. And could they learn some or most of it by themselves? And it's always nice to say, I can point you to a direction and you can do your own reading, because also like we can't expect every member of an ethnic group to know everything about the culture that somebody else could really just learn from their own research. So I think if it's more specific, then it's easier to see that it's a genuine interest. Then like, oh, where are you from and how is life there? When I lived in the Congo and people ask me how is Africa, I'm like, there's 45 countries. What are you exactly interested in? And it's very different from, you know, what kind of food you can get there. And I think if you ask back this way, like, okay, what in particular you're interested in, that probably they also have to think about, actually, yeah, what do I want to know?
I think both of those perspectives and your commentary is really helpful, because I also hadn't thought about it that way in basically engaging them versus just avoiding that commentary and making them think about it too. And then maybe that actually launches into a positive conversation versus just me leaving the interaction feeling frustrated because they don't realize what they're actually doing. So that's really helpful. Thank you.
I want to share a very nice, like a nice comparison experience on your English is so good. So the weeks before I was leaving the US, I met a man in an elevator who gave me oh, you're Hungarian, your English is so good. And like, yeah, but you didn't ask me when I left Hungary. And then I went to my new job in Geneva and there was a British man and same thing, you know, where are you from? I say I'm Hungarian. And his reaction was long time out, huh? And that's when I felt like validated. Yes, he understands what it means. And he thought about, like, the question was genuinely, where am I from? But then he didn't go to assuming I just got out of the country yesterday. But that comes from like a shared experience. He's also probably been out of the UK 15 years. But that's kind of what I want to, that's the point I want to get to have an understanding, like read the room, but for the person. And ask the question I want to ask in a way that doesn't impose my usually inaccurate assumption of them.
Thank you.
All right. If there's no more question, then we won't keep you longer. Sorry for a 20-minute pass. So
no, this is wonderful.
Thank you.
I think it's more important to allow the conversation to unfold. So I'm glad people
I
will.
really appreciate that you could all stay on the Saturday afternoon.
Yeah.
And I just also wanted to say thank you for entertaining the questions that I had earlier.
No, of course, they were great questions.
It's always a learning moment for us too, because, you know, there's only so many things we think about, and it's very helpful every time when we get different questions from different perspectives. So
we also learn more about each other because all of these answers can be rehearsed. So there are some stories I haven't heard before as well. So, you know, thank you.
We're planning to have a fireside type of chat conversation middle of December. We haven't pinned down the date yet, but we would like everybody to join us. You can see all of our socials on the last slide. It's going to be about